In this video, we're going to look at chemical bonding. Now, this is a hydrogen atom, and hydrogen has an atomic number of 1, which means there's 1 proton in the nucleus and it has 1 electron. Now, these are electron shells, and electrons are electrostatically attracted to the proton because they're negative and the proton is positive, and the first electron shell can hold 2 electrons. Now, in electron shells, the first shell will hold 2 electrons, the second shell will hold 8 electrons. When electron shells are full, the atom is very stable. So your noble gases are very stable because their outer shells are full. But in this case, we have hydrogen, which has 1 electron in its first shell, and it could actually hold 2 electrons, so only 1 electron in the first shell. Now, what that means in terms of bonding is hydrogen actually likes to form H2 because by sharing an electron each, they end up with 2 electrons in their first shell. So their shell has the 2 electrons now, so this is a single bond because each hydrogen atom is sharing 1 electron. So each atom shares 1 electron, single bond. Okay, now they have a full outer shell. With oxygen, oxygen has an atomic number of 8. Now that means that there are 2 electrons in that inner shell and then 6 in the outer shell. Now by having 6 in the outer shell, it can actually hold 8. So there is actually space for 2 more electrons in that outer shell. So 8 electrons in oxygen, 6 in the outer shell. So oxygen actually likes to form O2, which is the oxygen that we breathe, and it likes to form O2 by making double bonds. Now that means that each oxygen atom shares 2 electrons. Now by sharing those 2 electrons, their outer shell is now full. So there's 2 electrons, remembering that oxygen has an atomic number of 8. So there's 1, 2, and then they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which makes up the 8. But by sharing those 2 electrons each, they've ended up with 8 in their outer shells. So again, oxygen likes to share 2 electrons, forming a double bond, and then they end up with a full outer shell. Now putting those 2 atoms together, so hydrogen and oxygen, we have water, H2O. Now hydrogens, remember they've got an atomic number of 1, so there's 1 electron in their outer shell. But by sharing that 1 electron with an oxygen and another hydrogen sharing that 1 electron in single bonds, we now have our hydrogens, there's 2 electrons in their outer shell when they're joined together, and our oxygen's got 8 and this hydrogen's got 2. So this is all single bonds because the hydrogens each share an electron and the oxygens share an electron, then we form H2O. So again, each atom shares an electron. So the hydrogen, the oxygens share electron. They have a single bond, but they now have full outer shells. So the hydrogen's got 2 and the oxygen has 8. Here we have nitrogen. So nitrogen has an atomic number of 7. Remember, atomic number means the number of protons, but that also tells us how many electrons. So we have the protons in the nucleus, we have the electrons around, so that first shell holds the 2 electrons, and the second shell holds 5, because that's 7 in total. That means there's space for 3 electrons in that outer shell. So 7 electrons, 5 in the outer shell. Now, N2 likes to form by sharing and creating triple bonds. So they each share 3 electrons, and by sharing, because there's space for that in their outer shell, and by sharing those 3 electrons, they end up with full outer shells. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So N2 is a triple bond. They all have full outer shells of 8 electrons by sharing those 3 each. Carbon here, carbon has an atomic number of 6. So 6 electrons, 4 in the outer shell. So CO2 forms with double bonds. So you've got your 2 oxygens and a carbon, they each share 2 electrons and their outer shells end up full. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 for your carbon, and then you can count around, and your oxygens have full shells as well. So CO2, double bonds. So double bonds, full outer shells of 8.